Greetings my friends, how are you doing? This is Zed from Zed Shah, and in this video what I want to show you is how to make raw milk kefir. This is something I've been drinking for over 2 years now, and I have actually done a video prior to this one that you're watching where I talk about the actual benefits of raw milk kefirs and some of its history, how it's come about, and my actual journey into taking it, why I took it, the profound and positive impact it's had on my health over the past 2 years. And so if you haven't done so already, be sure to check that video out. I'll link to it in the description below. So in this video, we're going to get straight into the actual making process. As I mentioned, I've been drinking this for over 2 years, so I've been making it almost daily, at the very least on a regular basis, and I've been drinking it every single day too. So everything I'm showing you in this video is based on actual experience and not theory. Also, I've given the grains away to a lot of people as well because they do actually grow, which I'll talk about later in this video. And so I've seen the common potential pitfalls you may fall into as you're making a raw milk kefir for yourself. And hopefully I want to tackle that, hence a long video because I don't want to leave anything out. Also, at the very beginning when I started making raw milk kefir, I did my own research, potentially what you're doing right now. And I did see some things that some people did which are a complete no-no as I kind of delved into the journey myself. So obviously I want to point them out too, so make sure you avoid some of the mistakes people make when actually making raw milk kefir. So let's get straight into what you're actually going to need in terms of ingredients and materials to make the raw milk kefir. It's pretty basic what you're going to need, but let's go through that. So the first thing you're going to need are the grains. No way, Sherlock. So a few things to bear in mind about the grains. Now, number one, they actually look like what I think is a cross between cottage cheese and cauliflower. That's what they kind of look like. So the question arises, well, where do you source the grains? Now, there's two ways which I found quite simply where you source them. Number one, other people that make them. As I mentioned just earlier, these do grow. So if you're fortunate to know someone, or you find someone in maybe Facebook groups or health related forums, or even in your local health food shop or community centre, you may be lucky to find someone who makes it. Guaranteed they're going to be giving them away because they do grow. So that's your first route to take in terms of sourcing these. The other option you have is to source it online. In the UK specifically, and obviously I can only speak about the UK, it's where I live. There's two places that I found. There is an independent outlet that I found, which is called the Kefir Company, but also on Amazon as well. It's actually the same supplier. So do have a look around online. Now obviously you want to make sure they're an ethical company, they've got some history, it's not something a little bit shady. And obviously the online space is kind of, based on your own due diligence where it is you source it from. Believe it or not, it's Amazon company that I'll show on the screen right now. They're actually really good. They've got a fantastic reputation. They've been around for quite a while, and the grains that they supply you, which is where I got my grains from, are of very good quality, and they're also extremely affordable as well. One thing you want to avoid is the dehydrated grains. You do actually get them online. Basically, they're naff. You don't really want to be using them, so avoid the dehydrated grains. Also, you want to make sure the grains are coming from a reliable source. So in terms of countries, so you do get some of the grains that come from China. Now, I'm not here to kind of obviously belittle anything that comes from China, but specific in terms of the grains, you really want to avoid the ones that come from China. In terms of quantity that you're going to need, you're not going to need much. That particular store on Amazon, I think they sell it like teaspoon size upwards, and that's what I started off with. I literally started off with a heaped teaspoon size. And as I mentioned, as you make it, the more you make it, they grow, because what happens is the kefir grains feed on the lactose in the milk and they grow. It's a living organism. So you don't need a lot to start off with. Some people get very clinical in terms of the ratio of grains to milk. I'll be honest with you, I won't really bother too much. As long as you get between a teaspoon to a tablespoon size of kefir grains, about half a litre of milk, it's good to go. And obviously as they start growing, then obviously you can increase that kind of milk to grains ratio. So in terms of the sourcing of the grains, as a recap, you inquire about locally to people that you know, your health food outlets, community stores, online forums, etc. Or you buy them online. And obviously, as I mentioned already, when you buy them online, make sure you do your due diligence that you're buying from an ethical, reliable, good source. The other thing you are going to need is the milk. So there's a couple of things to kind of bear in mind with the milk. In an ideal scenario, you want to be using raw, full fat milk, as in it's come straight from the cow into the bottle, and that's it. That is going to be the best quality milk that you can buy. for a whole myriad of reasons. But in short, just know it's the best milk that you can buy. Now, there are a few caveats to that. Number one, it is quite difficult to source. I live in London. London, believe it or not, it's actually quite difficult to source good quality, genuine raw milk. There are obviously some legal issues around it. In the UK, it is legal, but they do put a health warning on it just for the sake of it, for compliance. But it's not readily available. You can't go to your supermarket and buy raw milk. You do need to buy from independent outlets. In London specifically, it's actually very expensive because there are a handful of outlets that do sell raw milk, like independent health food outlets. You have a Borough Market in London, world famous food market. So you can actually source these and buy these in person in places, in cities like London. But you're going to find it very expensive. I mean, the Borough Market one, I think they were charging like £4 or £5 for 1 litre, which is insane, which is quite expensive. So you can get them, but do note that they typically are quite expensive. If you're very fortunate to live in maybe a slightly rural location where it's more readily available, or you are very near to a particular outlet that makes them, then obviously go for that. So finding them locally to where you live, obviously just do your research online and you'll find those. You can buy these online and get them delivered to your house. But what I found with that one is it can once again get a little bit expensive because the milk itself won't be that expensive, but obviously it's going to be the postage, all right, because of the weight. And obviously they need to kind of put it in some kind of like kind of freezer pack or whatever. So it can get also a little bit pricey by ordering it online. But if you do your search around, there are some really good outlets here in the UK and also potentially where you live that do sell good quality, fully raw milk. They will deliver it to your house for quite a reasonable cost. It's just one of those kind of scenarios I guess we're in, all right? And once again, it's a topic for another day in terms of why raw milk is not readily available in your supermarket. So naturally, you're just going to pay a little bit more than obviously your normal milk when sourcing good quality raw milk. Now, failing that, in terms of the raw milk, there are a couple of services that I use to get them. There is actually a raw farm just outside of London in Hertfordshire that a neighbour of mine goes to every 2-3 months. So whenever he goes, I typically just order from him and he just kind of drops it off to me and I just keep that in the freezer because obviously you can freeze milk. I don't drink milk generally. I only ever drink it in terms of making raw milk kefir. Now, there is actually another service that does some deliveries in and around London. So what I will do, once again, I'm not affiliated to those, but I will link to that service down below and maybe use that as a starting point. I also will link to a couple of online places that once again I'm not affiliated to that I have ordered from in the past, and they're fantastic outlets. So any kind of like those 2-3 links that I do have that I've actually used in and around the UK and the London area specifically, I will link to down below and use that potentially as a starting point. And then obviously from there, just kind of do your own research. On a side note, depending on where else you are in the UK and abroad, if you know of locations yourself where people can source raw milk, honestly, feel free to put those links down below. I'm sure it will help many others that are watching it, be it you're in the US or Canada or whatever. So like I said, to conclude with the raw milk, ideally, you want to find somewhere local to you that you can go in person and save yourself the postage costs. Failing that, there are services online that you can buy them from. Now, absolute worst case, if you're not for whatever reason able to source raw milk or you find it's out of your price range, then you can use conventional milk from the supermarket. The only two things you want to get is you want to get full fat milk and you want to get the organic stuff, okay? It's important you have a high fat content because that's what the grains actually feed on, the lactose. So if you're going to get anything from the supermarket, feel free to do so. But like I said, make sure it's organic and full fat. It's not ideal. As I've stressed many times, you do really ideally want to be using raw milk. I have heard that raw goat's milk is actually the best thing that you can use, but that's an extremely difficult type of milk to source. I did source it once, my body didn't react to it too well, but I've heard from many others that obviously it's better, it's the best milk that you can use all round. So maybe that's an option you want to use as well, but that's a very difficult type of milk to get hold of. But like I said, if worst comes to worst, go to your local supermarket, source the organic, full fat milk. That's more than plenty to get you going. And obviously, if you do have the ability at some point in the future to source the raw milk, then you do want to migrate to that. So in terms of the implements that you're actually going to need to make the kefir, so in no particular order, you're going to need a bowl of some capacity. Now, one thing I will mention off the bat is you want to avoid using metal. Now, metal supposedly reacts with the kefir grains and actually damages them. So what you want to do is at all costs, remember throughout this entire process, you want to avoid your kefir mixture, your grains, etc. coming in contact with metal. So you want to be using things like plastic, obviously BPA free, Pyrex, glass, things of that nature. So with the bowl, you can use a Pyrex bowl, glass bowl, whatever you've got. I've got a BPA free plastic one here. Now you're going to need quite a decent size. Obviously, unless you're making a really small amount, I find the larger bowls are a lot more handy because you've got a bit more room to kind of work with. So you're going to need one bowl of some capacity. The other thing you're going to need is, as we go throughout this process, you're going to need to obviously sift out the grains from the milk. So we're going to need a sieve of some sort. Now, I have used the fine mesh sieve in the very beginning when I started making this. The one thing I found with that, and once again you'll see this as we go throughout this process in this video, it's a bit too fine. You're having to work really hard to separate out later in this process the mixture when it's all fermented. So what I find is the colanders, or whatever you want to call them, the kind of wider mouth sieves, are really what you want to use. And once again, you want a decent size to give you plenty of playroom. And as mentioned already, you want to avoid metal. So anything plastic or whatever, typically obviously they're made out of plastic, these kind of colanders. So you want a decent sized colander. The other thing you're going to need is obviously an actual utensil to kind of mix everything around. I've tried them all. I've tried the spoons, the large spoons, whatever. I found actually these, which I believe are icing spreaders, are actually the best thing that you can use. Once again, as you'll see the rest of this process, it just has a lot more room as you're scraping around the sides of the bowl, etc. You're mixing around the grains. This is fantastic. So I'm pretty sure everyone has one of these lying in their drawer. I've never actually used it for icing, but it's one of them must-haves right in your drawer. And believe it or not, it didn't come in handy for icing, but it came in handy for kefir. Go figure. So you're going to need an icing spreader. What you're going to need also are receptacles. Now, I've used a Kilner one because I want to be fancy. You don't need a Kilner, whatever you've got. So I know people that have reused peanut butter containers, right? Glass with a kind of plastic lid. Whatever you've got to hand. One thing you do need to have is the ability to seal that container, okay, the receptacle. You're going to need the ability to seal it and make it airtight, because as we go through this process and you end up with your finished kefir, you need to be able to make it airtight so it doesn't carry on fermenting. So whatever receptacle you use, make sure it's able to have an airtight seal around it. I use the Kilner, I believe this is the 1 litre ones, and these are fantastic. You're going to need 2 of them. So one, you have obviously your grains in, which I just showed you earlier, and the second one, you store your finished raw milk kefir in that. So you're going to need 2 receptacles. And finally, what you're going to need a tablecloth, and you're going to need a rubber band or a hairband, okay? Now the reason why you're going to need this, once again, it will all be clear later on in this video. When we mix the kefir with the milk, we want to allow it to ferment, and we're going to cover it with this. So you ideally want a kind of like a darker colour tablecloth, because you want to block all the light getting into the actual kefir mixture, and you're going to need a rubber band to form a seal around it. So there you go, those are all the implements and ingredients you're going to need. It's pretty simple. Most of the implements you most likely got lying around at home. So it's really just the grains and the raw milk you need to source. So let's get started on making raw milk kefir. So we have our grains in the Kilner jar. So now we quite simply mix the milk with it. So as I mentioned just earlier, there's obviously the topic comes about the ratio of how many grains to milk. Some people get very kind of technical about it. I just eyeball it. If you've got, let's say, about a tablespoonful, then I would mix it with about half a litre. And if you've got obviously slightly more than that, then I would mix it up with about a litre of milk. So what you do is you make sure, it's very important, as you just saw me doing, very, very important you mix the milk, because you want to mix the fat content. And so you pour that in. Pour that straight in. So now with the milk poured in with the kefir grains, a couple of things I want to mention is you want to make sure you leave some space on the top of your receptacle, because here's what happens as the grains are fermenting. What you're going to find is it's going to expand a little bit. Okay, so if you fill it right to the top, it will expand over. So you want to make sure you leave a decent amount of room on top for that expansion. The next thing you want to do before we cover this up is you want to stir it with your spatula, which I've already done. So just stir it briefly to make sure the grains are mixed in with the milk. And then what you do, you get your tea cloth and you quite simply cover it. Now, the reason why you put an elastic band or hairband on top to kind of seal it is obviously the insects or flies that get in. At the time of making this, we're in spring, approaching in summer, so you're starting to get flies around. So obviously they love this stuff, so you want to make sure it's kind of covered, and obviously it's still allowed to breathe. So now with the grains mixed in with the milk, we've mixed it around, we've covered it with a tablecloth. What we're going to do now, we're going to leave this for about 24 hours. Now, a couple of things about the main fermentation. So number one, what affects the fermentation process and how quick it is primarily temperature, the room temperature. If it's too hot, it will ferment quite quickly. If it's really cold, it will take its time fermenting. So you want to find a place in your house, in your kitchen, which is obviously at a very cool temperature. Now, like I mentioned, it's spring approaching summer. Here in the UK, the temperature's not too bad, it's quite mild. So it's perfectly fine here in the studio kitchen. And so leaving it out here 24 hours is enough. If it was too hot, then what I would do is find another place in the house where it's not as hot and it's a cooler temperature. And like I said, either way, you want to regulate that as much as possible by where you place it. And you want to leave it for about 24 hours. If you leave it for more than 24 hours, it's kind of gone a bit too far. Anything less than that and it won't fully ferment. So 24 hours is generally your sweet spot. And like I said, the temperature, you want to keep it around about a very moderate room temperature. The other thing you want to do, as I've already mentioned before, is you want to keep it away from direct light or sunlight, especially sunlight. So by covering it with a tea cloth, obviously you're preventing any flies or debris falling into it, but also you're kind of giving it shade. So keeping it where I've kept it now on the tabletop for the next 24 hours is perfect. During that 24 hours, what you want to do is about a couple of times you want to mix it around, because it's important to mix the grains around with the milk. Now, the story has it that obviously this comes primarily from Central Asia, the concept of kefir and the kefir grains. And what they used to do, they used to keep them in bladders, seal them up, and then obviously they used to then use obviously whatever materials they got around them. So they used animal bladders then, or intestines, and then what they did was they then hung them up on the door, and obviously as people will come in and out the front door, it will shake around the grains with the milk. And so obviously it kind of makes sense. So obviously I'm not encouraging you, right, to put it into a pair of intestines. It's perfectly fine in the kiln jar or whatever receptacle you've got. The key thing being, make sure you mix it around just a couple of times within that 24-hour period of the initial ferment, and obviously keep it covered at all times once you're done with that, and kind of keep that to one side. Now, one commonality I've found when I've given the grains to other people and they've made the kefir themselves is at this phase here, as we leave it out for the next 24 hours, they think it hasn't worked. Now, obviously, we're going to come back to this once the actual fermentation is done within 24 hours. And what you find is at that stage that people say, well, it hasn't worked or it smells really bad, and they typically throw it away. And I've heard that from quite a few people. Now, it's difficult, obviously, to describe smell on video, right? But generally, kefir just doesn't taste great. It doesn't smell great. It literally smells like gone off milk. So here's the thing. However, weird it sounds, what you want to do, you want to kind of just forget about the smell of the milk, okay? The smell of the kefir. What you want to focus on, which I will show you shortly, is obviously the separation as the fermentation is on the verge of completion. But the point being is that it's at this stage, a lot of people think it hasn't worked because of the smell. So just bear in mind, in short, that the smell is not great. So kind of like eliminate that from your psyche and just actually look at the separation, which we're going to show shortly. So now that that's being left now to ferment for the next 24 hours, I want to come back during that period for a couple of occasions and give it a good mix around. So with the power of video editing, I'll bring you back in 24 hours when the initial ferment is done. So my friends, 24 hours has passed. Did you miss me? No? Okay, fair enough. Right, let's go and check the kefir. Let's see how we're getting on. And so for the moment of truth, after 24 hours of fermenting, here we are. So what you're seeing here is a very distinct separation. Now during the 24 hours of fermenting, as I mentioned already, you want to mix this about 2 or 3 times. So I would maybe leave it for maybe 6 hours, 6-7 hours, mix it, leave it for another 6-7 hours, mix it again. So you want to mix it 2-3 times to make sure you're continuously kind of mixing the grains themselves with obviously the milk, to make sure all of it gets fermented. The second thing to bear in mind is, and this is a problem I hear a lot from people who attempt to make this themselves, they're not sure whether it's actually fermented. So in short, what you want to see is some degree of separation. And this is obviously a very good example because you've got the kefir grains and actually the finished kefir at the top here. And obviously what you have here is actually the whey solution right at the bottom. Sometimes what you see is the kefir mixture up here and some down here, and you see the whey in the middle sandwiched. So in one context or another, as long as you see a distinct separation and you see a clear solution, whey solution, then you know it's pretty much good to go and it's all fermented. As always, as I've mentioned before, the smell, sometimes people say, well, I'm not sure if it should be smelling all right. The kefir smell is the same throughout. So as long as it's not completely rancid, as in it's really, really hot, then obviously that's the only reason why it would smell like, you know, really bad. But as long as you're kind of maintaining the temperature, make sure it's not getting too hot, and it's that kind of a steady room temperature, that as long as you see some kind of distinction in terms of separation, then you know it's pretty much fermented. But like I've said already, roughly around the 24 hours mark at a steady room temperature is a great time to make sure that without a doubt that it's done what it's supposed to do in terms of the grains consuming all the lactose in this mixture. So now the next step is to sieve this out. So in order to sieve this out, we're going to need our receptacle, we're going to need our colander, and obviously we need our spatula. It's good to keep a little hanky or a tissue nearby, just in case you get emotional, or failing that, you kind of bits of kind of like milk fly around. So I always kind of keep a little tissue to the side. Now, before you actually sieve this out, I found it's actually better to give it a final mix. Okay, so let's just give this a good mix. And I find it's then easier to kind of separate out the grains from the mixture. So give that a good mix. So what we're doing now, we're now going to pour it into this. Bear in mind you will get little splatters of the kefir and milk. So you've got to be a little bit careful. So let's get this out into here. So now what I do is, I kind of obviously scrape out as much as I can. And we're going to obviously put the grains back into it to kind of repeat the entire process that we did at the very beginning. This is where the tissue comes in handy. Now, when I first started making this, I cleaned the receptacles, the containers every single time that I used them, and I found that it's really no point. You know, I use this for 2-3 kind of cycles, and then I wash it out because everything's going to go back in here anyway. So it's up to you. You know, I'm a clean freak, so like I said, I was cleaning it regularly. But I found there's just no point because everything's going to go back in. So there's, unless it gets really grimy, then obviously you don't want to get to that stage. So like I said, I make this every day. So I will just, after 2 or 3 days, I will kind of wash this out and kind of just keep continuing with the process. And this is where the spatula really comes in handy. It allows you to really move this around. It's important to move this around. So what you see in here, you can see all the kind of finished kefir coming out into the bowl. So keep giving this a good mixture. And this is why also the colander I found is better than the kind of the fine sieve. Because when you have the fine sieve, you're really having to work this quite hard. And it's kind of like 2 or 3 times the effort. Whereas this one, this kind of colander, is more than enough to kind of make sure the grains themselves don't go through. And just the finished kefir solution just goes into your bowl. So give that a good mix until all the solution has passed through. So we've got the same receptacle. We've got the grains now separate from the main actual kefir mixture. So what we're going to do now, so this is why I don't bother washing it every single time like I used to. We put the grains back into the receptacle. And obviously with this we're now going to obviously just repeat the process. So make sure you get all the grains in. Every last drop. So make sure I kind of get every bit you can. So this now, will go into the sink to be washed up. So before we deal with the actual kefir mixture, I now want to talk about the grains. So obviously these are the grains that are separated out from the process. So there's one or two things you can do here. Either one, you can repeat the process. Simply go back to the beginning of this video, fill this up with milk and just repeat the process. So that's option number one. Option number two is storage. You may want to pause when you want to make your next batch. It might be after a few days or a few weeks or even a few months. So these are a few tips about storage of kefir grains. If you're going to store this up until 1 month, okay, any time from now up until a month's time, what you do, you cover this with milk, raw milk, just enough so it covers the grains. You seal the lid and you put it in your fridge. That is it, and it will keep perfectly fine for up until 1 month. If you're going to store anything from 1 month to 6 months, you transfer the grains into a plastic bag or a plastic container. You don't have to cover these with milk. You can just put the grains straight into a bag or a plastic container and then put them into your freezer, and they will store perfectly fine from anything from 1 month up until 6 months. I know some people store them up until 1 year. So you can do that also, but I find that about 6 months is my personal limit. Obviously you decide what you want to do, but they will store perfectly fine in the freezer for up until 6 months. So that really covers you for anything. If you go on holidays or a break or a business trip, whatever, you will refrigerate them for up until a month, or anything longer than that, you put them into the freezer. Now, when you put them into the fridge for anything up until a month, obviously when you now want to make your next batch, you just fill it back up to the top with water and you, with milk, and you just repeat the process. When you freeze them and you go to use them, what you're going to find is and I found this myself, it's going to take you a couple of goes of making the kefir grains for them to kick back into full vitality. So they don't have the complete efficiency when you thawed them out properly out of the freezer. So it will take you a couple of goes of making the kefir grains once you've taken them out of the freezer for them to kick back into full force. But they do that very, very quickly. So like I said, anything for up until 6 months, these are perfectly fine to store. Anything more than that, potentially you could freeze them for up until a year. And I think that really covers most of you. I don't think most of you are going to be storing it for that long, right? If that's the case, then obviously just give the grains to someone else and just buy a new batch. But really, I think for 99.9% of you out there, that's enough in terms of the storage of kefir grains when you want to have a break between making your next batch. Another thing I want to talk about before we go back to the kefir mixture itself is something I saw on a video on YouTube, which is actually quite a popular video, on a tutorial on how to make dairy milk kefir, which is made by a British couple. And like I said, they've done a lot of terrible things that you should not be doing when making kefir grains. Basically, all the things you should avoid doing, they did. And one of the things they did when my jaws dropped is actually washed the grains. So at this stage of the process, they took the grains out in the colander and they washed it under a tap. So I'm just warning you, under no circumstances should you be washing your grains. There's no need to. You've got all the goodness associated with it. You store it as it is, or just make your next batch as it is. It's perfectly fine. If for whatever reason you feel the need to wash your grains, at the very least, use filtered water. You have chlorine and all sorts of chemicals in tap water. So why this couple felt the need to kind of wash their grains under a tap water, I will never know. And usually I don't like to pick up people like that, but that was just something I saw, and that was a complete no-no. So under no circumstances should you be washing your grains. There's absolutely no need to whatsoever. Just take the advice that I've given you in regards to storage, or just repeating the process for making your next batch, and you're totally fine. One thing I wanted to briefly mention are the grains in terms of them growing. You see, obviously they're a living organism and they're going to feed on the lactose in the milk. So the more you make this, the more they're going to grow. So what do you do as they grow? Now there's one or two things you can do. You can sell these. You can sell the grains. There's nothing stopping you. But the second option, which is my preferred one, and may I kind of humbly encourage you to do also, is to give these to people, educate them on the benefits of raw milk kefir. Because like I said, it's had a profound impact on my health. You can read many countless case studies on YouTube and elsewhere on social media. So what I do is, as they grow, obviously I don't need much. This is kind of like the limit I find of what you're going to need. And as they start growing, which they're going to do, start preempting the fact you're going to have to start giving them away. Now obviously you can store these, as I've discussed just earlier, but I would encourage you to give these to people around you. So start sowing those seeds to people that you believe are receptive to maybe wanting to try this out. So kind of start doing that in advance. So the moment you're ready to give these away, you've got people ready. And obviously if you want, you can just point them to this video in terms of how they make it. But definitely, I would encourage you to kind of share the love. Essentially, it's the best thing you can give to people. And then what I also do when I do give these to people for free is I encourage them to do the same also. Okay, so that's just kind of like a good practice that I personally think, if I wanted to encourage you to do, is to do that. So definitely bear in mind these are going to grow, so start thinking about what you're going to do with the surplus grains that you're going to come into contact with. So back to our kefir mixture. Now we've got the second receptacle, the clean one. So let's take the lid off, and all we do is quite simply pour the kefir into here. Make sure you scrape out as much as you can from the bowl. It's all goodness. So make sure you get that back into the receptacle. Okay, every last drop of it. And the bowl and the spatula can go into the sink to wash. So now that the kefir mixture is in the receptacle, and obviously we've done the initial 24-hour ferment, what we're now going to do is we're going to supercharge the potency of the probiotics by doing what is called a secondary ferment. And it's very simple. We're just going to cover it back up with a cloth, put the elastic band around it, and we're going to leave it out. Now, there's different times in terms of how much you can leave it out, but it's actually not for that long. I've typically found between 4 to 6 hours is a perfectly adequate amount of time to leave it out for a secondary ferment. Now, it's also at this stage, what I want to talk about is getting a more yogurty texture. Now, the way you achieve a yogurty texture is through the secondary ferment. And quite simply put, the longer you leave it out for a secondary ferment, the more of a yogurty texture you're going to get. So the less you leave it out for a secondary ferment, it's going to be more of a liquidy, kind of milky texture. And obviously the longer you leave it out, it's going to become more yogurty. So that's basically how you achieve a yogurty texture. If that's what you're going for, then obviously just leave it out for a longer secondary ferment. But do bear in mind, you don't want to leave it out on a secondary ferment for too long. Typically, I found the max is about 8 to 10 hours, obviously at a typical room temperature. Anything more than that, then it will actually go rancid. So a secondary ferment simply just recharges and boosts up the efficiency of the probiotics even more. Even though we've actually taken the grains out, it's still, we've got the probiotics consuming whatever is left in that milk. So by leaving it out on a secondary ferment, it just supercharges it even more, and it's obviously not that much extra work. So let's leave it on a secondary ferment. Let's put the tablecloth back over it, put the elastic band or hairband, whatever you're going to use. And once again, make sure it's all completely covered at a normal room temperature, not too hot, not too cold. And simply we're going to come back in about 4 to 6 hours and let the secondary ferment complete. So it's been about 5 hours, so I've left it at the midway mark, and let's take the cloth off, and you haven't noticed much difference. Sometimes you do get a tiny bit of separation. We haven't really noticed much difference here, but that's perfectly fine. It's been a normal room temperature for UK standards. And that's it. As long as you leave it out for no more than about 6 hours, you're going to maintain a liquidy kind of texture. And obviously, as I've mentioned already, leaving it out longer on the secondary ferment, it would become a more yogurty texture. But I want to go for a milky texture. So like I said, anything between 4 to 6 hours is perfectly fine. So there we have it. Our dairy milk kefir is ready to drink. So what we do now is we seal the lid and we simply put it into the fridge, and that is it. So I typically make this the day before I'm going to start drinking it. I find when it's chilled, it just tastes a lot nicer. There's nothing stopping you from drinking it right here and now. So put this into the milk, and what I found is it would typically keep for up until about a week. Obviously, you've got to keep the lid sealed at all times. It will actually carry on fermenting, believe it or not. But by sealing the lid and obviously cooling down the temperature inside the fridge, it will slow it right down. And I find, like I said, about a week is the limit. It will keep it in the fridge. If you start keeping it longer than that, even though it might be sealed in the fridge, it will start to actually become rancid. So I did consume it within a few days. I typically consume this within about 2-3 days because I have a member of my family drinking it also. And that is it. That is what you do now. Put it straight into the fridge and it will hold for up to about a week. So the final thing I want to speak about is obviously drinking the kefir. It's in the fridge, it's ready to go. So what are some tips that I've learned over the years in terms of drinking dairy milk kefir? Now the first thing I will say is it is definitely an acquired taste. Right? I hated it in the beginning. I was like, what is this stuff? But obviously you remind yourself that it's doing you a lot of good. Now the first thing I want to say in regards to drinking it is the following, and I will get onto the tasting in a moment, is based on my personal opinion, I find that drinking it first thing in the morning is going to do you a lot of good. Because essentially you've been fasting throughout the night, you've been asleep, and so having it on an empty stomach, obviously the theory is that it goes directly into your gut and obviously it gets to work. I find obviously if you're leaving it later on in the day where you've already got loads of food and other stuff in your gut being processed for the breakfast that you had or the lunch that you had or even the dinner that you had, in my personal opinion, it's obviously going to take a little bit longer for obviously the kefir to really get to work. So my personal opinion is ideally have it first thing in the morning. I get showered up as soon as I get up, do some meditation, and I drink it straight after that. So it's on an empty stomach. So drinking it on an empty stomach, I personally believe is going to do you a lot of good. Now in terms of the quantity that you're going to drink, I would take it a little bit easy in the beginning. You don't want to kind of like start doing a pint glass, okay? It's just going to knock you for the six. It's a very powerful probiotic, and obviously that's a good thing. But if you're kind of coming from a bad place in terms of your diet, and I have talked about this in the previous video, that obviously talks about the benefits of kefir and my experiences taking it, but just to touch on it lightly right now, obviously if you're coming from a bad health state, then taking a lot of this is going to knock you for a six in terms of your detox symptoms. So I would start off really kind of small. I mean, I don't know what that is, that's like, you know, a quarter of a pint, okay? Start off with that, and that's more than enough to kind of keep you going in the beginning, and obviously you build up your tolerance for it as you kind of move forward. But any effects you get from this are not bad, but obviously it's a very powerful probiotic, so the detox symptoms are going to be equally quite as powerful, and if you're not prepared for it, then obviously that can be quite debilitating, and obviously the detox can, you know, manifest itself in many different ways. So in the beginning I would just take it a little bit easier and obviously just work your way up. And to be honest, even moving forward, you don't need a huge amount of it on a daily basis. There's really no limit to how much you can drink. I do know people that drink 1 or 2 pint glasses a day, and personally I don't see anything wrong with that. But with me, I typically have about a third of a pint is what I kind of typically have day to day, and that's more than enough to kind of, you know, making sure your gut is topped up with a good amount of probiotic. The other thing is obviously now the actual drinking part of it. So to make it palatable, I started mixing it with this stuff here. Now I'm not promoting this. Available from my local supermarket. Now I started getting this because I had a couple of family members that didn't like the taste of the dairy milk kefir. So I got this. This is chocolate soy milk, and I just mixed on just a little bit with the dairy milk. Give it a mix, and that's it. And it just tastes like chocolate milkshake. You can mix it in with anything you want. A little tip about mixing the dairy milk kefir with whatever. It could be your smoothie, your cereal, yogurt mixture, whatever, in order to consume it. My personal opinion is you want to drink it as neat or close to neat as possible. Once again, strictly in my own opinion, obviously if you start mixing it with loads of things, it's going to take that much longer for your body to assimilate it into your gut. So try and take it ideally as neat as possible, but there's nothing stopping you from mixing it with your smoothie, with your cereal, whatever you want. On a side note, obviously if you're going to give this to kids, even more so, they're really probably going to dislike the taste. So just mix it in with whatever you need to do to make it palatable. Once you mix it in with a milkshake or whatever, you're not even going to taste it, and obviously it's doing you a lot of good. But just, yeah, like I said, based on my experience, you ideally want to drink it as neat as possible for you to get the maximum amount of efficiency from the dairy milk kefir. So there you have it, my friends. That is a wrap for this video where I showed my process on how to make dairy milk kefir. As I've already mentioned at the beginning of this video, I've been making this for over 2 years now. I've been drinking it daily. It's had a profound impact on my health in a positive way. And so everything I've shown you is based on actual experience and not theory. I've also tried to tackle many of the potential issues you may come across making it, because I've given the dairy kefir grains out to a lot of people now, so they've come back to me with questions over time. So hopefully I've tackled all of that, hence the long video. And needless to say, if you have any questions or queries, please don't hesitate to comment down below. I'll do my best to answer them. I'm not an expert with this stuff, but I've been doing it for a while now, so I'm kind of basing everything I'm showing you on my actual experience. Also, as I've also mentioned, but I will mention again, any links or resources I've mentioned in this video I'm not affiliated to. So obviously just take that as a starting point and feel free to do your own research. There's lots of information available online about where to access, raw dairy milk, the grains, etc. So I really do wish you the best of luck in starting to take the dairy milk kefir if you haven't done so already. Also, I will link to, as I mentioned already, the video I've done below, which is kind of accompanying this, which talks about the benefits of raw milk kefir, also my experiences taking it and how it's had a positive and profound impact on my health. And I know it's going to have the same for you, and I don't say that lightly. So also, if you haven't done so already, be sure to hit the subscribe button. I put out lots of videos like this. Also, I'm very active on my personal Facebook profile. Yes, not the fan page. Man, the fan page reach sucks. So I just linked you to directly my personal profile. That's down below, and also my Instagram. I'm active on both of those. It'll be awesome for you to connect with me on there also. And so that is it. So as always, I really do appreciate you watching. I hope this video has kind of served you well. If you have any questions or queries, don't hesitate to ask. I'll do my best to answer. I wish you the best of luck in taking this yourself, and do let me know if you do and the impact it's had on your health and your life. So I shall see you on the next installment, and until then, this is Zed from Zed Shah. Peace out.